Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Inspiring Change. I'm going to make this assumption all the time that everybody who listens to this podcast wants to make some changes in their life. And as I've said earlier on, my intention is to mainly speak to men because we really do need to make some serious changes. Our health statistics are not very good. Those of boys are also not very good. So, question always comes up about, well, where do I start? What do I need to do? And in part, my answer to that is that we need to rethink what it is to be masculine. You know, I know people throw around the idea of toxic masculinity, but I don't like doing that because it conflates ideas, and I've said this before. Masculinity is not the problem. And you've heard me say that patriarchy is. So, in rethinking this is one of the first ways to go about reevaluating or taking a sort of personal audit is to take a look at whether you're living your life according to your core values. Okay? Now, we all have a different sort of set to some degree. Yep, there's some constants that arise, like trust, honesty, integrity, authenticity, and so on. But one of the things that's useful, and it might be a nice little challenge for you to do in between podcasts, is to actually clearly examine what your values are, listing them out, and whittling them down to about 3 or at the most 6 core values. Now, as you may know from previous podcasts, the ones that I generally work with is love, respect, and cooperation. Okay? So, the question then is, why do we need to do that? Well, our values are, in a sense, our guidepost. If we act accordingly, we're going to feel better within ourselves. And the other part to this is that it's really a choice that we make. You know, people talk about, oh, well, I am the way that I am. I can't change it. And in a way, I see that as an excuse. I don't understand it, and I don't accept it. You know, especially if you're coming to see me as a psychologist or a psychotherapist, the mere fact that you're coming to see me means that you are actually wanting to make some changes. And if you're there because someone else has pushed you into it, you need to think again. One of my favorite quotes is from Vin Diesel, and he says, being a male is a matter of birth. Being a man is a matter of age. And being a gentleman is a matter of choice. And for me, gentleman equates with great man. So our road to being great really begins with understanding myself better. And so the thing that I look at in many respects with men is what their personal goals are about. And they're not about being more productive, being more efficient. It's about what really counts. So have a think about that. You know, just sitting here listening, what do you think really counts? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Probably less because I've got a limited time with the podcast. So I'm going to give you a heads up. If you were to come to me to do some counseling, to do some, coaching, one of the things I'm going to be looking for is, now, how well do you regulate your feelings? You know, do you lose it a lot? I mean, it's not uncommon for me to sit with men and, they've just come to my office and, they'll complain about the traffic and how someone cut them off And then they'll go, and, my behavior wasn't all that good either because, I might have been following him or I threatened him with a fist. And so that comes under the umbrella about how do I deal with my feelings. Now, positive feelings are easy. We just roll with it. But what about our negative emotions? What about things like fear and anger and aggression? Now, part of the process is also to understand the difference between anger, aggression, and violence. And the previous podcasts have really touched on that. Now, the other thing that's really, really important in my life is my capacity to be flexible. If I'm too rigid, the chances are at the first big storm, I'm going to do what a lot of trees do. I'm going to break and I'm going to fall. And there ain't no coming back from that one. Now, luckily as human beings, unlike being a tree, I can come back from that. And it's something that we often need to remember because a lot of times when we go down, a lot of us want to stay down. But the mark of a great man is that in adversity, when we've fallen, we are going to get up again. And that is what, in essence, the next step in our emotional and spiritual and physical development takes place, is that we become more resilient. So I want to be physically and emotionally and intellectually more resilient. So the way that I think about things is as important as how well I regulate my emotions. So if we take those areas and we sort of cement them down into our foundation, I can guarantee you that we're not really going to go wrong. So what else needs to happen in the framework? Well, one of the things that I'm confronted with daily when I'm working with men is that by and large, a lot of our life is out of balance, especially work-life balance. Now, here's the thing. If we're too in balance, we're going to stagnate. So we need a little bit of rocking in the system, okay? And I talk about the particular areas that we need to pay attention to as a hierarchy, as a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I need to take care of myself physically. So how good's your sleep? How do you introduce relaxation and exercise into your life? And how much of that do you do? And also, how do you manage what you eat? Do you have a tendency to eat well but drink too much? And drink, I mean alcohol. Do you use drugs to sort of give you that extra kick or that buzz, that, little bit of out of reality experience? The fact of the matter is that if you're doing the latter, that's actually going to come at a price, as does drinking excessively. And I deal with this again on a daily basis. We have a culture where alcohol flows much too freely, and yet it's legal. And the cost and the damage that alcohol does, both physically and emotionally, psychologically, and socially to people, is just enormous. So, again, let me come back. The next level in this pyramid is about how am I doing psychologically? Do I have a tendency to be emotionally expressive? Do I allow myself to be vulnerable? Which leads into the next level, which is about my social life. How do I connect with the world and those people in it? And at the peak of the pyramid, I talk about your spiritual world. That is having a purpose, a meaning, an intention to your life. And in some of the upcoming podcasts, I'm going to be talking about being a father and what is entailed in that. And this is where I go, you need to remember what I've been talking about, the stuff about emotional regulation. Because If you're dysregulated, that is, if you can't keep your emotions appropriately measured, your child or kids are going to react. They're going to do the same thing. So an emotionally dysregulated adult can't regulate a child's emotion. It's impossible. So you got to ask yourself, what's your child seeing? It doesn't matter whether it's a boy or a girl. You know, the thing with boys, though, is up to about the age of 7, dad's a superhero. He just doesn't wear, his underwear on the outside and a cape. Although some kids have asked dads to do that. So it's fundamentally important to be able to get that sense of how am I going to interact with the most important people in my world, and that includes your partner, your wife. Um, what is a child seeing in that relationship? But for the moment, let me keep it to you as a human being on your journey. And firstly, what's your relationship with yourself like? If it's critical, judgmental, ambivalent, confused, do you really think you're going to feel as good as you can possibly be? Do you think you're going to feel empowered? And where do you draw that? Do you compensate for feeling disempowered by trying to have power, dominance, and control over others? And in my view, that's a recipe for disaster. So the inspiration in this that I want you to take out of it is, firstly, doesn't matter how old you are, change is possible. I mean, for a start, even, the hard wiring in our brain, can change. And our body chemistry responds to that all the time. And I'm not saying that we should reduce ourselves to a bunch of networks, nervous networks in our system or neuronal networks in our brain, but rather think about it more as a metaphor. There is flexibility in the system. So when it comes to your thinking, you can take that anywhere you like. The question that you do need to ask yourself for in that particular context is, are you doing that in alignment with your values? Or is this a completely different ballgame that's got nothing to do with the values that you espouse? In my book, I put a little thing at the end of it where I talk about 8 characteristics of great men. And the first 2 is about having a noble purpose that we achieve through essentially hard work and not platitudes. And the second one is about a vision. The 2 I can almost collapse them into one. It's about my perception of myself here and now and moving forward. So those men who are listening to this, who are not your dads, don't write that off, because what you're practicing today will be part of that relationship in the future with your children. And if you're doing the right thing, they will be grateful for it. They will be thankful for it. And so will your partner or your wife. And I'm not speaking only about heterosexual couples. I'm speaking about any couple. Because in essence, being loving and compassionate and tolerant is not a question of gender. It's a question of being a human being. In Yiddish, there is a word for being a reasonable and a good human being, and that's being a mensch. So my thing is, just be a mensch. Don't be, conflicted or confused about what that is. Search it out. Define that in yourself. Now, one of the things that means is that you're going to need some courage. You're going to need some courage to stop denying your weaknesses, to stop making excuses, to be responsible for yourself, and to allow yourself to be accountable for what it is that you do. Now, that courage also allows us to be vulnerable. So I'm not always going to be right. You know, the essential problem that we as men often have is that we presume the moral or the practical high ground. I must be right. Rather than listening with an open heart and open mind to my partner, who might be giving us feedback. And, you know, the most respectful thing that we can do is to take that feedback on board. And again, let me connect that to then being a dad. It's really, really rare that partners in a family totally agree with how to raise children. There's always going to be some different points of view, different opinions. A lot of it these days is influenced by social media, which gets really, really scary. And so there's going to be conflict. There's going to be friction. And you need to ask yourself how you're going to work through that conflict and friction. Now, the first step is I'm going to stay in a loving space and I'm going to be respectful, and then I'm going to work on cooperating with my partner. Now, unless the other person has some really, really, batshit crazy ideas about what to do as a parent, then that's a relatively simple process. But there are times where we need to go, you know what, that doesn't sit well with me, and I'm not going to do that. But that's a really different landscape, and not one that I'm going to cover in this particular podcast, or probably in future podcasts. Maybe I'll see how that goes. So one of the things that helps in that whole context is my ongoing capacity to self-reflect honestly. And that means abandoning thinking positively all the time. Because in that process, I'm essentially at risk of denying being real. That is, identifying my weaknesses and choosing to do something differently and something better, something where I'm stepping up. Now, all of that is also going to require the capacity to have some confidence in yourself. Now, that'll grow. We're not going to necessarily have it in the beginning. It's like, being a dad. Most of us, when we step into fatherhood, it's generally a real wake-up call and somewhat of a surprise. We're often shocked by what we're confronting. We're certainly going to be sleep deprived. So it's going to push our buttons big time. And so the final point that I want to make in this process of inspiring change is, in order to be the best person that you can be, and I'm not being a perfectionist, I'm just saying step it up, is you need to examine your own wounds. And most of those are more than likely located either in your childhood, through school, through family of origin, but you need to work those out in order to evolve. It's very easy and unfortunately extremely damaging when we don't sort out and heal ourselves, because we're going to pass on the pain and the trauma and the damage. And, in a cold, hard light of day, I'm going to ask the question, do you really want to do that? Or do you want to be able to create relationships with, friends, partners, and your children that is inherently free of that trauma and the negative consequences that brings with it? So some major food for thought. And in the next session, I'm actually going to start looking more specifically at the whole fatherhood thing. I really think that we in our culture at the moment are so struggling in that whole area. And it's always wonderful to see how many guys I meet who are actually wanting to step up into being a great dad. And my comment is, if you're a great human being, if you're a mensch, your kids are going to be lucky, because they'll have that relationship with you that's going to help them grow. So until next time, good thinking, and do some critical reflection.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspire Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.